For decades, the idea of dual booting has been a quiet ritual among power users, developers, and curious tech enthusiasts. You install Windows for compatibility, gaming, and work requirements, and Linux for freedom. Control, performance, and learning. At startup, you choose a side. 2 operating systems, 2 worlds, 1 machine. But something strange has been happening over the last few years, and most people haven't fully noticed it yet. That clean separation between Windows and Linux is slowly dissolving. Not through a dramatic announcement or a press release declaring a merger, but through subtle changes, integrations, and shared technologies that are quietly reshaping how we use computers. The question is no longer whether dual booting is convenient or annoying. The real question is whether dual booting even makes sense anymore. If you rewind 10 or 15 years, Windows and Linux were philosophical opposites. Windows was closed, commercial, tightly controlled, and focused on consumer and enterprise dominance. Linux was open, community-driven, fragmented, and proudly independent. You either lived entirely in one ecosystem, or you split your hard drive in half and accepted the friction. Switching between systems meant rebooting. File systems didn't always play nicely together. Drivers worked in one OS and failed in the other. Workflows were interrupted. Dual booting was powerful, but it was also a compromise. Fast forward to today, and the landscape looks completely different. Microsoft, once famous for calling Linux a cancer, now ships a Linux kernel directly inside Windows. Developers on Windows can open a terminal and run native Linux commands without virtual machines or dual boot setups. Meanwhile, Linux users are running Windows applications, Windows games, and even Windows development tools with performance that would have sounded impossible just a few years ago. The walls haven't just cracked. In many places, they're already gone. The most obvious example of this quiet merging is the Windows subsystem for Linux. When WSL first appeared, it felt like a curiosity, a translation layer that lets you run Linux commands on Windows. Interesting, but limited. Then WSL2 arrived, and everything changed. Instead of emulation or translation, Microsoft embedded a real Linux kernel, maintained and updated by Microsoft itself. Suddenly, Windows wasn't just compatible with Linux tools. It was running Linux. For developers, this was a turning point. You could use Windows as your primary operating system and still have access to Bash, apt, systemed, Docker, and the entire Linux development ecosystem. Web developers, backend engineers, cloud architects, and data scientists no longer needed to reboot into Ubuntu or Fedora just to feel productive. The traditional reason for dual booting began to disappear. At the same time, Linux was undergoing its own transformation. Desktop Linux used to be criticized for poor application support, especially when it came to commercial software and games. But technologies like Proton, Wine, and Vulkan quietly rewrote that narrative. Today, thousands of Windows-only applications and games run on Linux with little to no configuration. Steam Play turned Linux gaming from a niche hobby into a serious alternative. Some games even perform better on Linux than on Windows, a sentence that would have sounded absurd not that long ago. This created an interesting symmetry. Windows users can run Linux inside Windows, and Linux users can run Windows software inside Linux when both sides can do what the other side does. The need to keep them strictly separated starts to fade. Then there's the cloud, which may be the most important factor of all. Modern computing has shifted away from local machines toward cloud-based infrastructure. Most servers on the internet run Linux. Containers, Kubernetes, DevOps pipelines, and cloud-native development are overwhelmingly Microsoft didn't fight this trend, it embraced it. Azure runs massive amounts of Linux. Microsoft contributes to the Linux kernel. Visual Studio Code, one of Microsoft's most popular tools, runs beautifully on Linux and is deeply integrated with Linux-based work. When your development environment lives in containers and your code runs on remote Linux servers, the operating system on your laptop becomes less important. Whether you boot into Windows or Linux, you're often interacting with the same tools, the same services, and the same environments. Dual booting starts to feel like a relic of a time when everything was local. Even file systems are no longer a major barrier. Windows can read Linux file systems through WSL. Linux can read and write Windows file systems with ease. Cloud storage syncs your data across platforms automatically. Git repositories live online. Configuration files can be shared. The friction that once justified having 2 separate operating systems on the same machine is steadily shrinking. Another subtle but important change is how Microsoft positions Windows itself. Windows is no longer just an operating system. It's a platform for running environments. With WSL Hyper-V and containerization, Windows increasingly acts as a host rather than a destination. You don't install Windows because you love its command line or its internal architecture. You install it because it lets you run everything else. This is a profound shift. In the past, Linux users dual booted into Windows for specific tasks like Adobe software, Microsoft Office, or certain games. Today, many of those tasks can be done directly on Linux or through compatibility layers. Meanwhile, Windows users no longer need to dual boot into Linux to get serious development work done. Both sides are meeting in the middle, and the middle is becoming the default. This doesn't mean Windows and Linux are becoming the same thing. Philosophically and structurally, they're still very different. Linux remains open, modular, and community-driven. Windows remains closed, centralized, and commercial. But at the user level, especially for developers and power users, the differences matter less than they used to. Think about how people actually use their computers today. A browser dominates most workflows. Web apps replace native apps. Cloud IDs exist. Remote desktops are common. Even gaming increasingly depends on online services rather than local installations. When so much of your digital life lives outside your operating system, the operating system itself becomes a layer rather than an identity. This is where the idea of the end of dual booting really takes shape. It's not that dual booting will suddenly stop working or disappear. It's that fewer people will feel the need to do it. The reasons that once justified the complexity are slowly being eliminated. There's also a psychological shift happening. New users entering tech today don't carry the same ideological baggage as older users. They don't see Windows and Linux as enemies locked in a cultural war. They see tools. If Windows lets them run Linux tools, great. If Linux lets them run Windows apps, great. Loyalty is replaced by pragmatism. Interestingly, Microsoft seems very aware of this shift by embracing Linux instead of fighting it. Microsoft ensures that Windows remains relevant even in a world where Linux dominates servers, containers, and development work. At the same time, Linux benefits from better hardware support, better tools, and broader adoption. It's not a hostile takeover, it's a mutually beneficial convergence. Some longtime Linux users see this as a threat. They worry that Linux's independence and values will be diluted. They fear a future where Linux exists mainly as a subsystem inside Windows rather than as a full alternative. Others see it as a victory. Linux didn't have to replace Windows. It infiltrated it. It became indispensable. On the other side, some Windows users worry about complexity and security. Running Linux inside Windows, containers inside containers, layers upon layers of abstraction. It all sounds fragile, but in practice, these systems have become surprisingly stable. For many users, WSL just works, Proton just works, containers just work. The complexity is hidden behind clean interfaces. There's also the role of hardware manufacturers. OEMs now ship laptops with Linux hardware support on Linux is better than ever. At the same time, Windows laptops are increasingly optimized for virtualization, secure boot, and subsystems. The hardware itself assumes a mixed-OS future. Education plays a role too. Universities teach Linux because it's relevant to servers and programming. Students use Windows because it's common and familiar. Instead of forcing a choice, modern systems let them use both simultaneously. The old requirement to dual boot just to learn Linux is fading away. So where does this leave the future? Dual booting won't vanish overnight. There will always be niche cases where a clean separation is desirable. Security research system administrators and enthusiasts may still prefer the purity of dedicated environments, but for the majority of users, especially developers and creators, the cost-benefit calculation is changing. Why partition your disk, manage bootloaders, and reboot constantly when you can access both worlds at the same time? Why maintain two separate systems when one can host the other seamlessly? The convenience is hard to ignore. The deeper implication is that the operating system wars, as we knew them, may be ending. Not because one side won decisively, but because the battlefield itself has changed. The real competition now happens at the level of ecosystems, services, and experiences, not kernels and boot. Windows and Linux aren't merging into a single operating system, but they are intertwining in ways that make strict boundaries less relevant. The future looks less like a choice between Windows or Linux and more like a spectrum where you pick the tools you need regardless of the logo on your desktop. In that world, dual booting feels like an artifact from a different era, a time when operating systems were fortresses rather than platforms. a time when switching contexts required a reboot instead of a terminal window. As Windows and Linux continue to quietly borrow from each other, integrate with each other, and depend on each other, the idea of splitting your machine in two just to access both starts to feel unnecessary. The end of dual booting isn't a dramatic event. It's a slow fade. One less reason to reboot. One more tool that works everywhere. One more wall removed. And by the time most people realize it's happening, they'll already be living in a world where Windows and Linux aren't rivals sharing a hard drive, but collaborators sharing the same machine